Mississippi, 1855. Inside a wooden chamber, veiled in white curtains, a master sleeps without fear. The oil lamp smokes, filling the air with a haze that makes the night feel heavier than a shroud. Outside, crickets sing. Inside, silence swells, like judgment waiting. Footsteps barely touch the floorboards, slower than a prayer, colder than a verdict. That night was meant for rest, but it became a graveyard of power. Grace Morton turned her master's dream into history's unspoken funeral. Grace Morton was born not in a home but in a wooden shed, where the cracks in the walls barely allowed daylight to slip in. The first sound she learned was not laughter, but the rasp of chains and the muffled weeping of women whose prayers never reached the sky. Her cradle was smoke from the fire pit, her lullaby the whispered songs of tired mothers who wove sorrow into melody. Silence became her inheritance. She learned early that speaking too loudly could summon punishment, while quiet watching could mean survival. Around her, life was divided by light. The big house glowed with candles, polished floors, and voices that carried authority. A few steps away, the slave quarters were swallowed in darkness, where shadows curled around every corner like bars of an invisible cage. Grace grew up knowing that distance was not measured in yards but in oceans. One side of the yard had chandeliers, the other side had bleeding hands. Her childhood was a map of contrasts. In the fields, she saw bodies bend under whips, but at night, she saw those same bodies stand together in fragile circles, murmuring songs of longing for a freedom most would never taste. Children played with sticks in the dust, but they also carried the scars of hunger in their eyes. Grace herself was quiet, with a gaze that lingered longer than words. She watched, she memorized. She became the kind of child who knew how many steps the overseer took before turning his head, who could sense danger in the shift of a shadow. In that silence, Grace's identity was carved. She was taught to bow her head, yet she secretly lifted her eyes to the stars when no one was watching. They seemed to promise that beyond the darkness of the plantation there might be another world. But the stars were far away, and every sunrise reminded her that her life belonged to someone else. Survival meant learning to live like smoke, drifting quietly, never drawing attention, yet refusing to vanish. In her late teens, Grace discovered a rare sweetness amid the bitterness. She fell in love with a young man who worked the same fields, whose laughter was as fragile as it was defiant. They dreamed aloud in whispers, speaking of a small house somewhere beyond the river, a life where their children would never know the taste of chains. In the fragile silence of nights, they promised each other freedom not as a gift from anyone, but as something they would carve out together. But plantations thrived on breaking promises. One morning, Grace awoke to find him gone. He had been sold overnight, without warning, loaded onto a wagon as casually as one might trade livestock. She was not allowed a farewell. His absence was like a missing heartbeat, an empty chair beside the fire, a shadow that refused to return. For days, she could not sing, and the silence she had once mastered now cut into her chest like a blade. Grief turned into a scar, visible only in the way she no longer smiled, even in secret. The master often boasted about his generosity, claiming he clothed and fed those under his control. But Grace knew the truth. This man who paraded his kindness before guests was the same man who had torn apart her family, who had stolen her future. The word mercy in his mouth was a mask that mocked her pain. Every time he strutted through the yard, every time he reminded them of his ownership, Grace felt the scar within her deepen. It was in that hollow where vengeance began to take root, not in fiery outbursts or reckless defiance, but in the cold soil of silence. She did not shout or curse. Instead, she carried her loss like a hidden ember, one that glowed hotter with every act of cruelty she witnessed. Love had been stolen from her, replaced with a void that nothing could fill. And into that void, the idea of justice twisted, desperate, inevitable began to grow. Every night, when the plantation drifted into its uneasy sleep, Grace sharpened her silence. She learned to move like a shadow, her footsteps no louder than the settling wood of the cabins. The moon became her companion, painting faint silver lines across the dirt floors, guiding her like a compass. She began to notice rhythms. Others ignored the cadence of crickets, the creak of doors, and most of all, the breathing of her master. She counted. Each inhale and exhale was a drumbeat, a reminder that the man who claimed dominion over her was still only flesh. While others sought rest after the torment of the day, Grace trained herself to stay awake. to listen. Her body adapted to the long hours, her heartbeat sinking with the rise and fall of his chest beyond the wall. In her mind, each breath he took was borrowed, and she was the silent keeper of that debt. Preparation did not mean weapons. Grace had no blade, no gun. Her power was patience, and patience can cut sharper than steel. She practiced holding her own breath, forcing her lungs to stretch until her chest ached. She rehearsed silence until she became silence. No cough, no whisper, no sigh, just the stillness of someone who had become a shadow of herself. Her days remained the same, endless labor, endless submission. But the nights belonged to her. As he lay surrounded by comfort, she sat surrounded by smoke and dust, teaching herself endurance. The room she lived in became a classroom where time dripped slowly, each second a grain of sand falling through an invisible hourglass. Grace's preparation was not a plan scribbled in haste. It was a weaving of countless nights, each one adding another thread to a tapestry no one else could see. And with each stitch of silence, the inevitability grew clearer. A moment would come when the breath she counted would be the last. To the outside world, the master was a gentleman. He dressed in fine coats, quoted scripture at the dinner table, and offered polite smiles to visiting neighbors. Guests left his home believing they had met a man of upright character, a model of Southern refinement. He was careful to stage his life like a performance, one where he always played the benevolent actor. But performances end when doors close. Behind the curtains, his mask slipped. Grace knew the other face, the one that cursed, struck, and demanded. He was not a man of mercy but of appetite, taking what he wanted, discarding what he no longer desired. Families were torn apart under his orders, sold like objects, scattered across miles of land. The pain of children ripped from their mothers, husbands from their wives, was the true legacy he left behind. He thrived on duplicity. His Bible lay open on the polished table, but his hands were stained with the hidden bruises of those who could never testify. He praised himself for feeding his people, yet he starved them of freedom, starved them of dignity. The contrast between his public charm and his private cruelty was so sharp it cut like glass. Grace saw it all. She saw him recline comfortably on feathered bedding while women wept in the fields. She heard his laughter echo through the house as men nursed their scars in silence. Each hypocrisy was another weight pressing down on her chest, another reminder that his life was built on stolen lives. The man who demanded gratitude for his false kindness had become the symbol of every injustice Grace endured. His face was no longer just his own. It was the face of the system that claimed ownership over her body, her love, her very breath. And that system, no matter how carefully polished for display, was rotting beneath its surface. The night chose silence as its judge. Moonlight streamed through the plantation windows, turning the master's chamber into something colder than a courtroom, yet far more absolute. The world outside was asleep, dogs curled in straw, crickets chanting their endless hymn, yet inside the walls of carved wood, history was preparing to shift. The bed groaned softly as the master's weight pressed into feathered comfort. His chest rose and fell with the arrogance of someone who believed tomorrow was guaranteed. The curtains swayed slightly, as if the air itself was restless, as if the night had grown impatient with his ease. Grace moved as if guided by forces older than law. Every step was measured, every breath concealed. She was not a woman in that moment, but the embodiment of a verdict long overdue. Her shadow stretched across the floorboards, taller than her body, heavier than her frame. In her silence, the room became charged with a kind of electricity, an invisible storm pressing down. There were no witnesses save the moon, no jury save the silence, no defense for the man who had built his empire on bones. When his eyes closed in trustless sleep, Grace became the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner of memory. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, as though unwilling to interrupt the trial unfolding without words. There was no scream, no plea, only the sound of life cut short by the inevitability of consequence. What he had sown in cruelty, Grace harvested in silence. And in that instant, the plantation shifted from theater to tribunal. His sleep became his summons, his final dream, the closing argument. By dawn, the master's bed was no longer a place of rest. It was a grave of illusions. The man who wore two faces had met the one truth that needed no mask. Silence, when it chooses, can become justice. After that night, Grace no longer lived as a servant, but as a shadow gliding between fear and defiance. The act that began in one chamber did not end there. It unfurled like a storm stretching across the plantation. Her silence had found its first punctuation, but the sentence was not finished. There was no written list in her hand, no ink on paper. Yet in her mind, names burned like constellations: overseers who cracked whips with glee, guards who laughed while families begged, men who carried out cruelty as if it were their duty. They had all become entries on an invisible ledger that only she could see. One by one, that ledger thinned. A figure would vanish, a voice would be silenced, a cruelty erased by nightfall. The plantation grew uneasy. Whispers replaced commands, and dread haunted the quarters of those who once walked with unchecked power. To Grace, each absence was not random. It was a mark, a pause, a comma in the speech she was writing against tyranny. Yet there was nothing frenzied in her steps. She did not shout, she did not rush. Her vengeance was as methodical as the counting of breath had once been. Each act felt less like rebellion and more like correction, as if the universe itself had sent her to balance the scales. In the cabins, people whispered her name as though it were both prayer and ghost. Mothers hushed their children not with fear but with reverence, saying her silence walked where they could not. To the enslaved, she was no longer just Grace Morton. She was memory armed with breath, a shadow refusing to be erased. By the time her work neared its end, the plantation was no longer a place of confidence, but of suspicion. Every creak of a door, every flicker of a lamp, seemed to remind those in power that the silence they once dismissed had grown teeth. Grace was writing a history without pen or paper, her punctuation measured not in ink, but in absence. The final confrontation did not arrive with thunder, nor with cries of war. It came in the quiet of a barn, lit only by the trembling flame of an oil lamp. The smell of hay and sweat thickened the air. Wooden beams stretched overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast, enclosing the moment in solemn witness. Grace stood in rags, yet her posture was no longer bent. For the first time, she did not bow her head. Across from her, the last man, one of the overseers who had carried out the master's cruelty, stared at her with disbelief. In his eyes flickered not only fear but outrage, the disbelief that someone marked as property could stand before him with judgment burning in her gaze. No words passed between them. The silence pressed harder than iron, more final than any sermon. Grace's eyes carried the weight of graves unseen, of families scattered, of nights lost to grief. In that silence, she was larger than herself, a vessel of every injustice she had endured. Her gaze alone cut sharper than a blade. The lamp's flame swayed, casting shadows that danced across the wooden walls. It was as if the night itself leaned in, eager to record this final act. Outside, the stars wheeled silently, as if heaven had opened its eyes. To some, it might have looked like madness. To Grace, it was clarity. When it ended, the barn grew heavier with silence. No trumpet sounded, no audience applauded. Only the weary sound of Grace's breathing filled the air. Each inhale weighted, each exhale releasing centuries of pain. For a fleeting moment, she stood as something unshackled, not a servant, not even a fugitive, but a figure draped in judgment, seen only by the night and by God. That night, Grace crossed the threshold from victim to avenger, from shadow to reckoning. The eyes of her enemy closed, but hers remained open, staring into a darkness that finally seemed to acknowledge her. Morning did not bring freedom, it brought capture. By dawn, the plantation swarmed with men, their voices clipped with fear disguised as authority. Grace was dragged into the daylight, her silence no longer her shield but her testimony. Shackles bit her wrists, but she did not bow. The sun was rising, yet its warmth felt like judgment burning her skin. Her trial was no trial at all. It was a ritual, hurried and cold, designed to erase her with efficiency. The words spoken by the judge were brittle, emptied of meaning, like the reading of a script written long before she ever acted. Witnesses were unnecessary, her defiance was crime enough. The sentence came swift, death by hanging. On the day of her execution, the town gathered as if for spectacle. Children sat on shoulders, merchants paused their trade, clergy invoked the order of heaven. Yet Grace did not cry out, did not beg for mercy. She stood beneath the gallows as if beneath a tree, her face calm, her breath steady. Some said her eyes searched the sky, others swore she whispered something only the wind could carry. What is certain is that her last words, clear enough for those nearby, struck deeper than any sermon. Even breath carries memory. The rope tightened, The crowd shifted, and the noon sun poured down like molten gold. Yet in that moment, Grace's silence spoke louder than the gavel, louder than the psalms sung to justify her death. She did not resist the end, because she had already transformed it. Her life had been forced into bondage, but her final breath broke free, turning into story, into memory, into something the noose could not claim. By the time the crowd dispersed, the air still trembled. They thought they had extinguished her. Instead, they had enshrined her in the very silence they feared. After Grace's body was lowered, the crowd dispersed as if returning from a festival. The marketplace reopened, sermons resumed, and the machinery of plantation life attempted to grind forward. Yet something had changed in the air, something they could not name. The owners, once secure in their authority, now posted guards at their doors. The clink of spurs echoed louder in the night, as if fear itself patrolled the land. In the cabins, whispers carried her name. Mothers hushed their children with lullabies that slipped her story into rhythm, transforming her into both caution and comfort. Around fires, the enslaved spoke of her in fragments, the silence she wore like armor, the eyes that did not flinch, the words she left behind. To them, she became less a woman and more a presence, an invisible hand resting on their shoulders in the dark. Children asked who Grace was, and the elders told them, weaving her into folklore. She was a ghost who walked fields at night, not to terrify but to protect. She was the reason overseers glanced nervously over their shoulders, the reason even silence seemed alive. The more the authorities tried to bury her memory, the more it spread underground, whispered like seeds hidden in the soil. Meanwhile, preachers thundered from pulpits about order and obedience, but their voices trembled. They spoke more often of rebellion, of fear, of the threat of silence turning into storm. Grace had unsettled something they could not cage, the knowledge that even the most fragile breath could resist. The plantation itself carried her ghost. The bed where the master once slept seemed colder, avoided by visitors. The barn where she stood tall in judgment was abandoned, its beams groaning as if under memory. Every creak in the night became a reminder. Injustice could be met with stillness sharper than steel. Grace Morton's name never appeared in official records. Court documents reduced her to a slave woman. Newspapers buried her beneath rhetoric. Yet in the invisible archive of memory, her story lived. For every man who locked his door tighter, there was a child who whispered her name into the night. For every sermon of warning, there was a song hummed in her honor. And so, her breath lingered. It haunted those who had power. It protected those who had none. And in the sleepless nights that followed, the South found itself confronted not only by rebellion in flesh, but rebellion in memory, one that silence itself had chosen to carry. Grace Morton's name was meant to vanish. The courts erased it. The ledgers ignored it. Yet, memory refused to obey. She became not a page in history but a shadow on its margins, reminding those who listen that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes it is the last weapon left. Her story is not about violence, but about breath, about how even the smallest inhale and exhale can resist. In the end, Grace's life testifies to a truth larger than any plantation, larger than any gallows. Injustice can be strangled not only by rebellion in arms, but by silence that refuses to break. Her last words linger. Even breath carries memory. And so, when we breathe today, we too carry fragments of her defiance. Even silence strangles injustice.